Good morning, everybody. Oh, and thank you for coming to hear me speak. I'm going to speak just a little bit about my father, who served in both the Finnish Army and then the U.S. Army, and how all of that impacted our family. So, as was mentioned, no talk about a Finnish person is complete without having understood the meaning of the word Susu. Has anyone familiar with that? Yeah, you don't count. Susu is a trait that's deeply embedded in the Finnish character. And it encompasses courage, resilience, endurance, tenacity, pride, and strength. That one word indicates your determination to overcome hardships, any hardships you meet in life. This word is not translatable into any other language because it doesn't exist in any other language. So this is always very well portrayed in soldiers in Finland, with soldiers in Finland. Now, where is that happiest little country in the world? So let's review a bit. Whoops. This is Finland, right here. And right next to it, across the upper arm of the Baltic Sea, is Sweden, which some of you know very well. And then at the very tip is where Norway starts, and then before it winds down around the western side of Sweden. But the thing with Finland is, this is Russia, and Finland's entire border is right next to Russia, which is an uncomfortable situation. And down here are the Baltic countries, Germany, Poland, and so on. Okay. My father was born into a very heavily military heritage. On the left, you'll see my grandfather, that heavily decorated soldier. That's my grandfather, Toivo Lassila. And on the right is my father as a newly minted lieutenant in the Finnish Army, and his name is Eino Lassila. Well, my grandfather fought in the Civil War, the Finnish Civil War, which gained Finland finally total independence from being a Grand Duchy of Russia. My father fought in the Winter War as a battalion commander, 1939 to 40, and also in the Finnish Continuation War, 41 to 44. He was also a battalion commander in that, as well as chief of staff in the brigade and division levels. Okay, so this was the beginnings of the Winter War of Finland. So in 1939, the Soviet demanded some strategically important land for their military purposes. The Finns refused. So the Soviets bombed Finland, and they sent 600,000 soldiers across their border into Finland. And that's what began the actual fighting. So one of the resulting battles within that war was this Suomussalmi-Raate Road battle. And this battle was considered one of the most important, historically, victories that Finland won in the war. So if, let's read the stats, the weather stats. So in 1939, the coldest winter on record was the coldest winter on record in 60 years. The Gulf of Finland froze. The temperature went down to a negative 58 degrees, which is where metal seizes and lubricants and medical supplies freeze. These two photos give a really good idea, a really good representation of why the Finns were able to outsmart the Russians, even though Finns' number of soldiers were that much lower. So you can see on the left side, it's hard to even tell that there are soldiers in there that are involved. So the Finns would move very silently because they were on skis and pulling sleds. They were always in the woods, so they had total mobility, as well as being very quiet. They even had reindeer there. By contrast, the Russians were highly mechanized, and they were road-bound because they couldn't fight in the forest with those, and they were clearly visible. They were like sitting ducks in the middle of this terrain, and they were very vulnerable to all and anybody who could or would attack them from any direction. Let me see. Yeah, I will tell you. Then here is an actual map of Finland with this war going on. Let me get this, and this will help. Actual. So here is, okay. The war took place right down here because the Russians wanted this town they wanted control of this town, Oulu, which is it was an important seaport. Plus, the Russians' goal was to bisect Oulu so that the Finns would have to fight on two war fronts rather than just one. And the problem that the Russians had to overcome is this Suomi, this little town, which blocked their ability to get to Oulu to do all that. So my father's battalion, specifically, they fought about 40 yards below this Rate Road, and just east of Suomussalmi to prevent the Russians from getting through. There was also a really important supply rail route that went through to Oulu, and that was another objective of the Russians wanting to get control of this region. And by the way, this city is really important. It's called Kajaani, and I was born there. Just saying. And again, I'll mention that even in today's military history in Finland, that even though Finland did not win the war, this particular battle is still important in history for what they could do to have the strength that they did against. They were actually able to encircle and annihilate two full Russian divisions, which was quite something for a country that small. So Finland, oops. Oh, I'll go back to the other first. Let's go. Well, Finland lost the war. And just to say some final comments about that war, a peace treaty was signed in 1940, and the Finns had to cede 16,000 square miles to Russia. They had to, 11% of their population had to be relocated and repatriated. They also had to give up Hanko Peninsula, which is down in the southeast. They had to lease it to the Russians as a military base for them. And they also had to cede a small part of Karelia, which would be right down here. So, and just to make it even worse, in the 1 hour before the treaty, the peace treaty was signed, or became effective, I should say, the Russians again bombed Finland for that hour, savagely, just to make a point. Now, you might be wondering what this is. So this slide is this actual lamp that you see in front of you right here. And the base of this lamp is a mortar shell, thank you. And the helmet is the helmet of a Russian that my father killed. So my father had this made into a lamp, and this would always be on his desk, but it was a reminder he wanted every day of the heavy price that comes with defending freedom and independence. And you'll notice there's Where is it? There's a, yeah, the Russian star and all that. It's quite heavy, and feel free afterwards to come up and touch it and feel it and look at it and see how much it weighs. And let's see, so. Okay, then 16 months after the Winter War, the Continuation War started. The Soviets were again meddling with all the internal affairs of the Finns. And the Russian military at this point outnumbered the Finnish military 21-1. Norway and Denmark had fallen to Germany. Sweden had declared neutrality. And the Soviet had annexed all the Baltic states. And Finland was very afraid that they would be next. So Finland essentially stood alone with the entire border next to Russia. So for some time, the Germans had been offering, I should say they had been making offers to Finland that in exchange for military assistance, Russia would be able to get a staging base for their battle and for their invasion that they were planning into Russia. They also would do it in exchange for getting a rail route going through all the way up to northern Finland, because then the Russians could reinforce their troops that were in Norway at this time. So Finland had refused those offers, and then on June 25th, 1941, Russia again bombed Finland. They opened aerial attacks on them. So Finland's choice at this point was to either fall under the rule of Russia again, or to accept assistance, military assistance from Germany. So the Continuation War was called that because the reasons for even the Winter War, the prior war, they were largely similar to what drove the Continuation War. Let me see, and that war lasted from 1941 to 1945, so it was pretty lengthy. Now, the aftermath, of course, Finland lost the war, and the aftermath of that was they had to pay heavy reparations again to Russia. Russia ceded more of Karelia, this part of Finland. For over 400,000 Finnish people had to be relocated and repatriated from Karelia into Finland. Finland was also required by the Soviet to grant legal status to the Communist Party in Finland. The Finnish Army was tightly restricted in size, and a Finnish commission was created to oversee the internal affairs in Finland, as well as serve as the head of what was now the state police. They would have control of all state police affairs. The Finns didn't trust the Russians. That's just an understatement. They still don't trust the Russians. And I could have used 5 of those lines, and then it would have even been an understatement. So facing all that, the Finns wanted to be prepared for yet another possible attack by the Soviets. So the Finnish commander-in-chief, always, of the army was Manet, right, sitting right here. They are at his summer house on the edge of the Baltic Sea. This is my father, kind of just stretching his legs there. And this meeting was called by Manet because he decided that their only choice now was to plan and execute an underground operation that would help prevent them in the event of another attack. And this elaborate network would contain all defense plans, attack plans. The Finns would also, or this group of 21, also would bury vast amounts of weapons, ammunition, what else? Explosives, all kinds of communication gear. And they would plant, let me do this first, they would plant all of these stockpiles of what I just was mentioning, again, along the border, right along the border between Russia and Finland. And there were many, many, many of these caches. There wasn't, it was everywhere. In fact, even today, as recent as 2 years ago, they were still unearthing some of these weapons when they would take down a home, a barn. It was farm country, typically. There'd be a lot of barns out there. So then, in 1945, the summer of 1945, the state communist-controlled state police uncovered this plan that had been put into effect. So all of those people, the soldiers that were involved in planning this or executing it, they were arrested and imprisoned per violation of treaty according to the Armistice of 1944. So this was my father's cell, and this was the last of 3. They shuffled these prisoners around a lot. This was the toilet, the wooden box, which they had to clean every day. And the other thing they had was just this table that, for anything they had to put on a table, and they slept on cots. So, oops. At one point, well, during the year that he spent in prison, all of those prisoners realized that after a year, they would never be brought to trial. They would rot in jail because they would be denied a trial. And they were not allowed any outside communications like newspapers, radios, books. They did not want these soldiers to know at all what was going on in the world because they were trying to break their spirits and their souls. And they also didn't get any writing materials. So an interrogator of my father's approached him one day and asked that if he would be willing to escape, the interrogator could help him because the interrogator himself wanted to escape Finland. Thank you. So my father agreed, and a plan was devised where the interrogator was under the guise of taking my father, I think, to a medical appointment. I'm not sure about that, but it was outside of the building of the prisoner, and it was for some war-unrelated reason, and it was during that transit that my father was able to escape. This is my father's prison photograph. You can see it says, NCO Lassila, and he's a major there, and it was in May 24th. Whatever. And so this was the picture or the photo that was circulated while the state police that was under Russian rule right now was looking for him. So my father escaped. The plan was to escape to Sweden and hopefully get asylum there. So he escaped. He had to go up where there's still land and then up through here and then hopefully down to Stockholm. Now, when he got to Sweden, 3 times he was denied asylum by Sweden because the Soviet Union was putting political pressure on Sweden not to assist or aid any of these prisoners that were escaping. And Sweden abided by that. So my father hid there. This is all well-forested country. So my father hid in the forests and just largely often outside. Sometimes he found vacation homes that were vacant, and he would break into them and spend a night or 2 there. So it was about, I might not be totally accurate, but that lasted for about, I'd say, 7 months. And then there were some sympathizers in Sweden who decided they would help these men. And they assisted them in getting visa applications in and a passport. So this was a visa application, and this is the passport, and they were to go to Venezuela. As you can see, it says in transit to Venezuela, and the length of stay would be only for the purposes of being in transit to Venezuela. But my father and several of the other escapees that had gathered, they were going to take their chances no matter where they were supposed to go. That was a Swedish passport that he was issued. So they got, oh, sorry. So, where's, okay, I get it, where Dawn is, but thank you. So in December 1947, they arrived at Fairfax, Virginia, and they got off the boat, all of them, with no intention of getting back on and going to Venezuela. And to their surprise, there was a representative from the Finnish American Veterans Association from Harlem that was there to meet them. So they got off, and the representative took them by bus up to New York City. And there they had them set up for host families so they could get room and board while they were there. And they immediately started looking around for jobs because they didn't have any jobs. So now they could apply only for odd jobs and construction jobs because they couldn't speak any English. And they didn't have skills other than being in the military. And so my father got a job as a construction worker. And you can see he became a union member of the cement and concrete workers of the local 20 in New York City. So that's what he did for quite a while. And then Bill Donovan, sometimes called Wild Bill Donovan, he was the OSS Director at the time, the Office of Strategic Services, which is actually the precursor to our CIA. He had gotten wind of these soldiers entering the U.S. And he advised President Roosevelt that the U.S. Army would be very smart to take these men in for their winter and cold weather warfare expertise. So there were two problems. These men were illegally in the country, and in those days, the military, the U.S. Army, did not accept recruits who were older than 28 years, and all these men were between 35 and 45. So Bill Donovan advocated Congress to please pass a special act that would give these men citizenship in exchange for their service in the U.S. Army. And of course, the Finns said, oh, no brainer. So they were taken quickly, like the next day, they were taken to Montreal. I think it's back here. Well, you probably know where Montreal. So they were taken from New York City up to Montreal. They were immediately given legal papers to enter the U.S. again, but legally this time. And then when they got back to New York City, they were recruited as privates, and they were immediately sent across the country to Fort Lewis in Tacoma, Washington for basic training. So here are these Finnish soldiers all together. And this is my father right up here. They're kind of waiting what to do. Let's do this. Now, meanwhile, back in Finland, I was really having fun with my sisters in the woods in Finland, which is like nirvana. Oops, sorry. But I'm not always so happy because I had to shovel a lot of snow in Finland. It was hard work. I'm telling you. And those sisters, of course, wouldn't help me. They loved watching me. So, but we also had a personal nurse with us on duty 24/7, and that would be my amazing mother. My mother had, at this point, been without a husband, without her husband, during the 6 years of war with Russia, while she endured the death of her mother and the death of a 7-year-old child. Then she faced another year while he was in prison. Except for speaking to him, she was allowed to see him once a month through glass. Then another year, which was involved in his escape and his time to get to the U.S. And at this point, it had been 6 months in New York City so far. Well, and he actually had gone to Tacoma, Washington. So while we were in Finland, we were advised, probably through channels of the American Army, that we should be going to Sweden to wait safely for the U.S. Army to give us legal entry into the U.S. Now, the Soviet-controlled police knew that the families of the escaped prisoners would be trying to follow to be with their fathers and their husbands. So that state police had set up checkpoints along the way from Finland, and they were in Finland, going north again up where crossings would happen to Sweden. So my mother quickly packed a suitcase, one suitcase for the 4 of us, not knowing where we were going or how long we would be there. She was able to make one call to one of her sisters to tell her we were immediately leaving the country and would probably never be back. So here we are back in the same area of Finland, Sweden, with the North Baltic Sea there. So in order to flee without raising a lot of suspicion, our family doctor stated he would drive my mother and my oldest sister with a car up through northern Finland. Again, that positioning was about right here, but it's not above, it's over the water. Did I mention the farmer that was helping escape? Oh, yeah, I'm so sorry. There was a farmer in northern Finland who had heard of these families trying to follow their husbands, and and he was willing to row the escapees, the families, across the tip of the Gulf of Bothnia to safety in Sweden. So that's where our family doctor took my mother and my oldest sister. He drove them up there, dropped them off at the farmer's house, and when it got dark, then the farmer rowed my oldest sister, my mother, across to Sweden safely. And then within about 3 to 4 days, I'm not quite sure, but it was less than a week, an aunt of mine took my other sister and I on foot, went to the farm also, but we walked across this long bridge that goes across up there during the day because the assumption was that the state police would not be questioning a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old, which they didn't. So, let's see. So we stayed in Sweden, also north of Stockholm, with some acquaintances for close to a year. And then we were able to get transit and legal status to get on a boat. And within 10 days of being on a boat in some stormy weather, which I remember, we saw land and the lights of New York City on May 8th, 1948. And when we got there, we got off at in New York City, and within a few days, we were on a train going to Fort Lewis, Washington, which is the picture you saw of my father before. And within just a couple of weeks in the state of Washington, we then took a train and went across the country to what is now called Fort Moore, Georgia, but it's Fort Benning is what it was in those days. And I can tell you the only thing I remember about Georgia is the eternally hot weather and cockroaches like I have never seen before in my life. Yeah, but there we were, the typical immigrant family. And then after let's see those. And then by 1950, we were taken to Camp Carson, Colorado, or now it's called Fort Carson. So you can see how barren it was in these days. And the buildings back here were soldiers' barracks, but were vacated. So that's where we lived. And some very kind families lent us or donated furniture for us. And we shared a communal kitchen with 8 other families, 3 of them also being Finnish families, so that gave us some comfort. And that's how our life in the U.S. began. And so began my father's role in winter and cold weather warfare up at Camp Hale as an instructor with the 10th Mountain Division. So you can see this is my father, and these are 3 Finnish soldiers as well. Other of the soldiers were sent to Alaska, some to Fort Bragg, various places, but these 4 men stayed a couple of years doing this in Camp Hale, which is now a national monument. You guys probably know, yeah. And so let's see what else. Okay. So this is kind of a recap, a really nice recap of our journey. All of us essentially followed the same route. So we came across from Stockholm to Fairfax, Virginia, on up to New York City. The men went to Montreal and back, and then went over to Fort Lewis, Washington. In a couple of weeks, we came down to Fort Benning, Georgia, and then back up to Colorado. So that was quite a bit of travel for just 2 or 3 years. And this is my father's military, American Army service, and I'm not going to read the stuff to you. I'll just point out that he did enter the Army as a private, and he retired as a full colonel. So he began as a private, and then he, let me get this straight, in 50 and 51, as the instructor at Camp Hale, he was Master Sergeant. In 51 to 53, he went to the Korean War for a couple of years. And let's see, then he was commissioned, yeah. In 1953 to 57, that's not highlighted. So 57 to 58, we went to Germany, and he was promoted to lieutenant colonel there. And when in his last tour of duty, which was in Minnesota, he was promoted to a full colonel. So, all right, Finns have Susu. Thank you. Thanks. You guys have any questions?
Questions for Liisa?
When did your father learn his English?
The Army trained them all. In fact, I have report cards that were issued to him during. He had terrible problems with prepositions because there are no prepositions in the Finnish language, and there is no he and she in the Finnish language. It's just hen, which applies to everybody. So
When he came to America, he did not speak English?
no. He could speak German and Russian and Swedish and Finnish. No English.
Have you been back home recently?
Oh, yeah, in the last couple of weeks. End of July, I got back. I like to go every so often. I have one family member left alive, but I have very good friends there, and it's just an amazing experience for me. It's like I go back in my life that also feels like my life. But I would never leave here, yeah.
What happened when your mom and the kids just left? What happened to your home there? I mean, did it stay in the family?
I don't know.
In the
I don't know
forest
if that little house was rented or if we owned it. My sense is we did not.
Oh.
And one reason, we typically were living in Helsinki, but because the war was way up north, that I was born in that northern town, and I think the move was made so that if my father ever got leave or could come home for a day, it would be easier for him to see us, which really didn't happen, but yeah. Yeah, hi, yeah.
Can you tell us what he did in Korea? And also, how long did it take him to learn English? Does it say?
Well, from the records, it indicates that he was sufficiently, he did sufficiently in English. I believe it was, by the time he was in Camp Fort Carson, he did.
How much time is that?
That would be for about 4 years. 3 years, sorry. You know, he still, I mean, my parents spoke with really heavy accents, you know, but they could get along, and my father developed it better than my mother did because he had to use it every day, so, yeah.
Do you speak Finnish?
I do. I do. So when we came to the U.S., we never spoke English at home. We always, we didn't speak English at home. We always spoke Finnish. Because language is a really big part of any culture that you live in. And my parents did not want me to forget the culture and the words associated with it and the traditions. And so it wasn't until I was 18 and went to college that I wasn't speaking, totally submerged in Finnish at home all the time. Yeah, and I'm grateful for that. You know, now I can read it and write it, and when I go to Finland, it's like, oh, yeah, I can feel it. It just feels so good. You know? Oh, yeah.
The question about what did he do in Korea?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just getting that piece of paper out because it has his.
Boy, I'd be in there, I could feel it.
Where is that last page? Is it? No, let's turn this back and see. Oh, it has to start over, sorry. I can't just go back to that last page?
Well, it got out of the slideshow.
Oh, okay, well, you know what? I'll bet it's in this copy of mine.
But it basically was,
There it
in my
is.
understanding, he was doing the same thing he was doing at Camp Hale. You know, the Finnish soldiers knew how to fight in cold, brutal weather. Well, guess what Korea is, you know, during the wintertime. And our soldiers suffered quite a bit early on until we kind of learned how to do this better. So we were making the maximum use we could have out of the Finnish soldiers and everything they knew there. But again, what I find amazing is you're looking at the career of a person who came over to the U.S., couldn't speak any English, was initially a private, very quickly became a master sergeant, became a major within 2 years of that, because the Army recognized the skills he had. A lieutenant colonel, commanded a battalion in Vielflicken, and I know that area well as a combat engineer in Germany. That's right up along the border, and that's part of the covering force. So that was quite a command. And then he ultimately retired as a full colonel. Talk about a career. None of us can claim having done anything quite like that. So,
Finns have Susu.
yeah.
Thank you for giving good examples of that.
Yeah, having served in 2 militaries too.
Yes.
Yeah, quite impressive.
Right.
Quite impressive.
Thank you.
What rank was he when he was done with the Finnish, when he was finished with the Finnish Army?
Major.
So he was a major.
Start-
He was still part of that group that did the underground thing with Mannheimer, the general?
Yes.
Well, he was a
He was.
battalion commander,
Yeah.
so typically for us, that's at least a lieutenant colonel. So, but, you know, things could be a little different, but he was fairly senior, you know, in the
Yeah.
Finnish Army.
Yeah.
So did he talk about how it was going from commander to private? Did he ever talk to you about that? Because that had to have been quite a mental change.
No, Finnish men, soldiers don't do that. They don't come home and say, ugh, I had the worst day because he'd go sit at his desk and stare at the lamp and think about the cost or the price of fighting for independence and freedom. Yeah, so, yes.
I apologize if you already answered this. There's a big time delay, and we were watching because of the overflow in the library, so I apologize if you already answered this.
That's okay.
I have a question about the time frame. You said your father and these other guys eventually made it to Virginia and then up to New York City. And you talked about Wild Bill Donovan talking to President Roosevelt. But Roosevelt died in April of 45.
Right.
So when did your father initially, I mean, was he a prisoner of, a political prisoner after the armistice was signed in 45?
Yes,
Then he spent a year?
a year in prison.
Then he spent a year in Sweden.
No, then he escaped. It took him about 8 months to become legal or get asylum in Sweden. And then
So he didn't get to the US until like 46? Or,
47.
So really,
December.
the Wild Bill Donovan thing probably happened with President Truman.
Yes, I think initially Roosevelt knew also, there's all these intelligence avenues in the world with the military. So at some point early on, yeah,
You arrived in the United States
48.
48.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes.
Lisa, I know your father and the men that were in Mannheim's group with doing subterfuge were considered criminals by the Russians. How did the Finnish people regard them? Are they heroes now? Are they?
They are initially, because the Finnish population didn't understand everything that was going on underneath the wars and who was what. And in Finland, especially in those days, anybody who went to jail for any reason at all, well, of course they had to be a criminal of some kind. So there wasn't that support for them yet. And plus, because the state police and the Communist Control Committee also influenced the media that was going out about these Finnish men, there wasn't much thought. But, so it wasn't until probably, I'd say 20 years after that, that the story started to unravel, and especially because they didn't know Mannerheim had picked these men to do this thing. They just knew nothing. But eventually they did become heroes, and movies have been made about them, and there are memorials, that kind of thing. So at this point, they're really highly regarded as like the last brave effort to try to keep Finland safe, which it has been. Now the worry again, the only reason they joined NATO again is because there's Russia right next to them, and when that happened to Ukraine, you just don't know. Yeah.
Were there other groups earlier than your father that tried to escape or to do other things? Or was this pretty much the only group?
Of the 15 Finnish soldiers that came, that's all I am aware of. Actually, there were 2 more that decided not to join the Army. So there were 15 that did join the Army, the U.S. Army. But that's all because there weren't that many prisoners that escaped.
And do you know what happened to those who stayed in the
I
prison?
don't know. And for all the books I've read, I haven't even read about them, but that would be interesting to know if they just rotted in jail or if they eventually got out, because they were being told they would never be brought to trial. So good luck, buds, Yeah. Oh.
Did your father document his experience?
You guys can tell who this person is. Yes, because they couldn't get any writing materials in prison. My father's the highly decorated grandfather could also visit my father once a month in prison. And he smuggled a pencil to my father, who my father then kept in the seam of his shirt. He hid it in there. And then my father would write on toilet paper every night, because that was the only paper they were allowed. So he kept a journal the full time that he was in prison. And then when he got out, the second half of his book is the escape and being here in the United States. And it's very interesting. Yeah. Yes?
Did the interrogator make it to the U.S.?
I don't know. I don't know.
He escaped.
Yeah, he did escape. And then he and my father parted ways before my father got asylum in Sweden, because that took a while. And I think the interrogator probably had other connections in Sweden, and he wasn't anybody who had broken the law. He had been doing his job. He just got tired of it and wanted to leave. So, yeah.
You said his book, your father's book?
Yeah, he has a book that was actually in Finland. It was a bestseller because when he retired in 1968, he took out all his toilet paper, which and then he sat down with his lamp at his desk and he started writing. And in Finland, because Finland has the highest percentage of people that go to libraries, and they have some award-winning libraries in Finland. They're astonishing. And so giving books for a Christmas present or any present is the best present you can give anybody. So just like here, movies are released before the Oscars are going to be announced. In Finland, all the really good books are released because then, the ratings come out for them. And so my father's book was published the same year that Leon Uris's QB7 came out. And I have the newspaper articles where they've lined up these books. It's an ad. They lined up these books that were 4-star books for that particular year. It must have been by now 69. And he had a 4-star rating. And yeah.
What's it called?
Vuosivalpon vieraana, which means vuosi is year, and Valpa was the name, like the police, the communist Russian that was in control, and vieraana means for a year. So the title literally translated, a year is the guest of the state police.
Has it been translated into English?
I translated it.
It's available for sale?
It's not published that way, but with my daughter's guidance and pushing, and we're going to get it probably published, in a book form that can be
Purchased.
And read.
There's a smart woman.
Well, we know one of our other speakers, Don Skanga, has developed the whole process of how you electronically publish a book. Self-publishing. And that would be something to consider
To look into.
too,
Mm-hmm.
because for those of us who like to see a little bigger print,
Yeah.
what we're reading,
Yes.
that's a marvelous way to do it.
Well, there are some pictures in it, though.
And one of our members also, John Petticolas, his daughter is a publisher too, so.
Oh, I'll have to talk to you guys. Yeah.
Match up with him.
No.
Yeah, I have 2 sisters, but they're older, and you have to prod them a lot to, join in this and get the project done. So I'll just, yeah. Yes.
What happened to Finland? How long did it take to get rid of the Russians? And how did that?
That ended in 1947. I forget which part of that truce ended then, or I'm not real clear on that because I was gone and it didn't impact me in any way. But they've had a relationship with Russia that they knew they had to develop, and it has been successful. There's a trade of industry and trade of technology, and there's some trade of services, like Finland has all the great wood and wood pulp products and all that kind of thing. So, but now,
NATO will change things.
well, they already did. It was like the door closed. So Russia is not, and Russians are no longer, they used to come to Finland all the time because they loved all the shopping and the art and all that kind of business. And I would go to Finland and you could hear him speaking Russian. I'd say, excuse me, what are you doing? But I Wasn't quite that rude, even though that's what I was feeling inside, but now you don't see them anymore, so I'm glad of that. Charlie?
Lisa, I just want to mention that there is a Wikipedia entry for Ilo
Yeah.
if people want to take a look at it. So there's information out there on the
Yeah.
internet. I wanted to ask you a question. When Nancy and I went to Helsinki last summer, I think it was, we noticed that the street signs are in Finnish, but also translated into Swedish under. Can you talk about the relationship there? and what-
Yeah. Sweden owned, basically, Finland for 700 years? Correct me if I'm wrong, somebody, but some lengthy thing, like never since, yeah. And then in a deal with Russia, they gave Finland over to Russia, and Finland became like a Grand Duchy of Russia. And then my grandfather was one of them that fought what they call the Civil War to gain Finland gained total independence. However, because the Swedes had so much history in Finland for a century or more, there have always been two official languages in Finland, and that's Swedish and Finnish. So every sign you see, everything is in two languages. And for quite a while, the eastern third or quarter of Finland was almost only Swedish-speaking people. And even the town itself, everybody there. And my aunt, who was she was a Swedish Finn, and if she went into a store that spoke Finnish to her, she turned around and left, and that's how strong that sentiment was. But everybody there is bilingual, so you learn Swedish and Finnish right away. You always have to learn to speak English, and then you learn one or two other languages. Their school system is very strong.
And now both countries are members of NATO.
Yes.
Significant.
Yeah, and so you can tell Sweden, too, was under the same political pressure, sort of, even though they were neutral, they were harassed by the Russians. And they had to kind of walk that fine line about what Russia politically was telling them to do or not to do, so, yeah.
When again was your father instructing at Camp Hale?
The first time was 51 to 53, and then after the Korean War, he came back from 55 to 57, 56 or 57, then we went to Germany.
Because at some point, Camp Hale, wasn't it deactivated and razed to the ground?
Mm-hmm, it was.
Much later.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's probably a dumb question, and I might have missed it while I was out of the room. I flattered as the whole thing anymore. Anyway, I noticed that Finland was denied participation in the U.S.-created Marshall Plan. But they had to have been aware of the fact that they only joined the Germans because they were fighting off the Russians, who had been the Germans' buddies, and now Germany was going after them. So didn't that strike them as something? Here they are, of course, nobody's going to allow the Russians after that, but it just struck me as really strange that Finland couldn't be part of that repatriating everybody and get everything done simply because of that. Did that ever factor in?
This is the little that I know that happened. So when World War II was going on, the Germans had frequently come to offer Finland military assistance because they wanted that staging base for their attack on Russia. And they wanted that transit line going up to Norway where their troops were. So, but at the end of the continuation war, they were denied access, or they were denied membership in the Marshall Plan. Is that what you're?
Yeah, that's what I was asking. It didn't strike anybody as strange that even though they knew what was going on with Finland, that they decided not to include it.
Well, Finland stood alone, period, in the whole world. That's all. And when part of what they had to agree to after the continuation war, that was one of the terms.
So it wasn't the United States that denied them participation in the Marshall Plan, it was
No.
the Soviets.
Right, right.
Oh, okay.
Exactly.
And the Soviets did that with a lot of the Eastern Bloc. It was Poland, Czech Republic, all those areas, Romania. Well, at least it's NATO, and we can do a little better.
Yes,
Your language is very difficult, and it's nothing like any other language, isn't that
correct,
correct?
correct,
Yeah.
correct. Apparently, it's the second most difficult language in the world, but I don't know that. But I will say one thing for the Finnish language. its alphabet is like ours, A, B, C, blah, 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 the same characters, characters look the same. And each letter has only one sound, not like in English, but, you know. So, is you know, E is E. So, and then the accent on every word when you speak Finnish is always on the first syllable. So if you know the alphabet and you know how each letter sounds, and you always speak with accent on the first syllable of the word, you're speaking Finnish, but you don't know what you're saying.
Folks, I'm going to ask you if you would, please. I think that Liisa would be willing to stick around for a few minutes if there's other individual questions, but just for the sake of time. And I'd like you to once again give a nice hand to... The museum would like to present you with one of our challenge coins for the museum in appreciation for you coming and giving this wonderful talk.
Thank you so much. I loved doing it.
One last announcement real quick before we break up. Did somebody lose a tiny little bayonet? We found this somewhere in a chair over there. We just wondering if this is anybody.
Only in the Vets Museum. Oh, and also, if anybody wants to come up and touch and feel this, yeah, it's a little hot now, but it's kind of interesting. And just lift it and see how heavy it is.
I just want to point out, I brought a picture and a model of a Finnish aircraft.
That's a Finnish
During the...
That was a wonderful talk, thank you. I have a friend from years ago who was here in America, but she grew up in Finland. And one of the things that she told me was that the roots of the Finnish language are the same as the roots of Chinese. And that she could understand a little bit of Chinese and also a little bit of Hungarian.
Hungarian.
And she said Chinese. And the reason for that, she said, was in the 1400s when the Chinese came across Asia and into Europe.
Yes.
Some of the warriors didn't go back. They stayed there.